My guest is Mark Stevens. He's written a very unusual book on his father, escape, evasion, and revenge. This is the book, and we're going to discuss that book, and we'll discuss Mark. Thanks. Mark, why did you write this book?
Well, I guess I wrote it initially as an attempt to try and get to know my father. He died when I was relatively young. I was 22. And as an average teenager growing up in Toronto, one really doesn't take much of an interest in the lives of one's parents. So
did you know he was a hero?
I knew he had a certain specific medal from the Royal Air Force, and that he had been a bomber pilot, and that he'd been a prisoner of war for a number of years and had escaped several times. But I didn't really connect that. I didn't put it together in my own mind and realize what kind of heroism that took.
Did he ever take you to see The Great Escape?
He took us to see some war movies. The Battle of Britain sticks out in my memory. I was a little young when The Great Escape actually came out,
I see.
but certainly we watched it on television together.
And he never said, "This is me," or?
He never did, oddly enough.
I see.
I think he really wanted to forget the war. He really wanted to put it behind him.
I see. And why did you not want to put it behind you?
There were too many questions. There really were.
Because he is a man of mystery.
Very much so. I started to realize there were more and more books coming out which named him and mentioned his heroism, discussed it in the very briefest terms, because as you well mentioned, his story is very much a mystery, or at least was up until the time I was able to access certain files in Britain's National Archives, which had been marked secret until the year 2051. Which I found terribly odd as well. But I was able to access those files through a Freedom of Information Act application, and what came out was a story like no other.
Yeah, well, he's certainly an unusual man. I mean, both his bravery, his flying, and certainly when he was in prison for 4 years.
Well, he was a German Jew who's I guess was very fortunate in that his mother saw that it was a good idea to get he and his siblings, his two siblings, out to safety in England before the worst of things came to pass. He got to England in late 33 or early 34. His younger sister was only able to get out in 38, and their mother was not able to get out herself, unfortunately, and ended up committing suicide about 6 weeks before the declaration of war.
And he assimilates very easily into British culture with an Oxford accent and this kind of, you get a sense he adopts the style of the whole class.
That's very true. And I think part of that is because his father died when he was very young. He was only 6 when his father died, and his mother immediately sort of exiled him, if you will, to boarding school in Bavaria, which unfortunately, and unbeknownst to anyone in the 1920s, was the hotbed of activity of the Nazi Party through the mid to late 20s and early 30s. So my father went to boarding school, was essentially on his own in the world from the age of 6. So I think that really played a large part in why he did what he did later on in life. He was able to become a very good actor, I think.
Well, then he joins the intelligence afterwards, where he has to engage in deception and all that. But you call the book, it's not only the evasion in that part of it, and the heroism, but you call it revenge. And there's the only thing I got bothered by, because when I read the book, I never got a sense of a man of vengeance. I got a sense of honor and determination and discipline, but revengeance is very personal, and it didn't come through as that. So I'm curious about that in the title.
Well, I have to say that's my own take on the story, to some degree or other. I now know after the fact, much later than the fact, that our family lost somewhere between 10 and 15 members to the Holocaust, and I'm including some of his uncles who died under very suspicious circumstances in the mid-1930s, for whom no cause of death is listed anywhere, but they were all wealthy, educated men, and one can make certain assumptions, I believe. So given the fact that on one of his escapes he went to his mother's home only to discover then that she had committed suicide 2 years previously, I thought perhaps that might have steeled him somewhat.
I see. But in your case, I mean, because your own relationship, mother and father, he comes across as also cold. You're very clear in the book about that.
He was very distant as a
Very
father.
distant as a father. And that your mother was a wonderful, warm, terrific woman. And she raised you as a Catholic.
That's true.
Have you left Catholicism, or are you still a practicing Catholic?
I have left the church, and interestingly enough, my older brother met and married a Jewish woman living in the United States and has since converted to Judaism.
And yourself, have you ever been attracted, or it just you're a secular Jew and you leave it at that?
Pretty much. I'm not really a religious person.
Yes, and your father wasn't, clearly.
Not at all. In fact, he never had a bar mitzvah.
Yeah, but though he did go, when he was in the mess, you say he went to the Protestant services before they'd fly out in the afternoon, and you speculate on that it's really a part of his cover-up.
No question. In fact, my mother subsequently told me, after my father's death, that had she known he was originally Jewish, she probably wouldn't have married him. Not through any of her own prejudice, but she was a French-Canadian Catholic girl in Montreal in the early 1950s, and it just wasn't done. By him presenting himself as an Anglican, which is, let's face it, pretty much as close to Catholicism as you can get without actually being Catholic, that was considered socially acceptable at the time.
And a high Anglican at that.
Correct.
So he comes across, and he develops also, you get the sense of him developing the style, and that's must be how you experienced him, as this very reserved and very officious almost, not quite, but that sense of him, but remote very clearly.
Yes, that's very true.
Has that affected your life, and do you now know and rewrite your own life after writing the book and understand yourself better because of it?
To some degree, I would have to say yes. Although having said that, through I guess my teenage years, and probably much more so after the death of my father, I vowed to myself that if I ever did have children, and sadly I don't, but if I ever did, I would be a much better father than my own was.
Well, that's all kids say that. It's not only
okay.
My own kids say the same thing.
But again, knowing what I now know about my father's history and his background and what he accomplished in his life, I don't feel any bitterness whatsoever towards the way he was. I think he was a product of his upbringing. Again, he was alone in the world from the age of 6, and he really needed to keep many, many deep, dark secrets in order to stay alive. For example, during his whole period of his incarceration as a prisoner of war during World War II, which amounted to some 3 years and 8 months, he was without protection from the Geneva Convention. That probably makes him virtually alone in the annals of the Allied forces, of the tens of thousands of prisoners of war taken by the Nazis in World War II. He was probably the only one who had no protection whatsoever under the Geneva Convention. And should the Nazis ever have discovered his true identity, they would have been perfectly legally within their rights to take him out of the camp and shoot him immediately as a traitor to Germany. He was a German citizen, after all.
So the legacy of your father on your own life, though, why didn't you put that in your book? Because it's just there. It's as remote as your father is, frankly.
And maybe I'm that much of a son of my father. It's quite conceivable that I did inherit some of his traits, as much as I would like to say I didn't. Having said that, though, the real reason for my writing this book was to get his story better known. And I really made a conscious decision to subjugate my own story to that of my father's. After all, he was the war hero.
Yes, and it's written as this kind of heroic story. And it's true, when you write stories of heroes are always distanced. They're not, you don't do a lot of introspection and internalization, because it's a lot about events. So it starts off, I mean, when you start off with those bombers, and I had no idea, by the way, those bombers were so vulnerable as you presented it.
A thin shell of aluminum, less than a millimeter thick, is all that protected you from bursting flak shells at 15,000 feet, 50 caliber bullets from German night fighters, or not 50 caliber, 20 millimeter. And I believe one of his crewmen on one of their missions got a German cannon shell through his thigh and almost bled to death. They were very lucky to get him home safely.
Yeah, and that was a particular vulnerable one that he was flying, not the big Lancasters.
That's true.
Anyway, Mark, I want to thank you for coming on the show really much. I'll show your book again, and I hope people will buy it. I think it's a good read and well worth knowing your father.
Well, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for your time.
As the body grows older, it loses its ability to prevent cells from anarchic reproduction. Senescence is the scientific study of the aging process. Can it be slowed down? In politics, there is also the potential for terrorist cells reproducing anarchically. Even the Bible has something to say about such rebellion in the story of Korach. Join us next week for our show on senescence and rebellion.